II, the War Abroad. World War II was an incredibly destructive war. When I described World War I described it as perhaps the most horrific war in the history of the world. And I talked about the degree of suffering that individual soldiers endured during that war. In fact, World War II is far more destructive than World War I. And the only reason we might say it was less horrific, potentially, for the individual soldiers was simply that the degree of destruction had grown so massive that individual soldiers were as likely to be wiped out and obliterated at a moment's notice as they were to suffer a serious wound. With that said, more than 50 million people were killed as a result of this war. There were many new methods of destruction and new technologies introduced, much more effective and powerful tanks and motorized vehicles than we had seen during World War I. Planes, bombs, aircraft carriers, new artillery and guns of all different varieties, culminating, of course, with the atomic bomb. And the mass destruction was taken to a whole new level during World War II. The kamikaze pilots crashing into American ships in the late stages of the war. A mass grave of more than 100,000 Polish victims murdered by the Russians. More than 150,000 killed from the atomic bomb at Hiroshima, 140,000 at Nagasaki, and the unimaginable genocide of the Jews in the concentration camps, more than 6 million killed. So this was an incredibly destructive, brutal war. And while the United States certainly had no choice but to join the war in earnest after the attack at Pearl Harbor, we can look back on this kind of destruction and say that certainly American efforts to remain neutral prior to the attack at Pearl Harbor were not misguided. We'll begin our discussion of the war abroad by looking at the European theater, events in the Atlantic, on to Northern Africa, and then Europe itself. Beginning with the war in the Atlantic, which, as I've described to you, in some ways the United States had been waging already through most of 1941. It was in the Atlantic that German submarines, who traveled in groups known as wolf packs, were utterly dominant. By 1942, German wolf packs patrolled just off the coast of the United States, and in fact, German submarines were spotted very near the harbors of Jacksonville, Florida, Charleston, South Carolina, and elsewhere. It is during this period that the coastal cities like Jacksonville, like Charleston, and elsewhere went through blackouts, not from power outages, but so that the German subs would not be able to spot any targets at night. And so these German wolf packs dominated the early period of the war, sinking more than 400 American ships over the course of the war. The United States had little chance to turn this war around until they were able to come up with some way of defending themselves and ultimately turning back the German submarines. Also in this early part of the war, Winston Churchill and FDR met personally several different times. Churchill, in fact, traveled to the White House and stayed with FDR. And there are many stories of him just making himself at home in the White House, roaming the halls in his bathrobe. Indeed, Roosevelt and Churchill enjoyed a very close personal relationship. It wasn't necessarily easy for them, though, to reach agreement on the broad strategies for the war. It took quite a bit of discussion. Remember that it was the Japanese that had attacked the United States directly and driven us into the war. And so it wasn't necessarily a foregone conclusion that the United States would join England in its efforts to defeat Hitler first. But ultimately, that is what FDR agreed to do. Hitler posed a more immediate threat and a greater threat to the security of the rest of the world than Japan did at that time. And so they agreed to make defeating Hitler and the Germans their top priority, meaning that the war in the Pacific was in some ways put on hold. It became a war of just holding back Japan until we were ready to really focus on that theater of the war. One of the other great points of debate and discussion was how soon the United States and Britain might open a second front in the European theater. And I think for a moment I need to remind you that at this point the primary front, or the first front in the war, was on the Russian front. That is where most of the action was going on, where most of the casualties were being taken. And so it was the Russians and their leader, Joseph Stalin, who were in dire need of a second front. They really needed the other allies to attack the Germans from behind into the mainland of Europe. So this would become the second front. And in essence, what Stalin wanted in that second front is a D-Day style attack onto the mainland of Europe. Well, as I'm sure you're aware, Stalin would have to wait 2 years before he got that second front, the summer of 1944. And so Churchill and FDR decided early in the war that Germany was just too strong and Europe was too powerfully defended to risk launching a direct attack at that time. And the United States as well was still sort of gearing up for this war effort. And so they agreed that the initial attacks would go through northern Africa, and they would try to get at Germany and Central Europe through what they called the soft underbelly of Europe, launching this attack through northern Africa, up through Sicily and Italy, and getting to Germany that way. Over the next slide, we will talk about how those efforts went. In 1942, the Allies concentrated their efforts in the theater in northern Africa. While this might be a largely forgotten part of the war compared to things like the D-Day attack and Pearl Harbor, it certainly was a noteworthy theater during this phase of the war. Despite Allied thoughts that this led the way to the soft underbelly of Europe, the fighting in Africa was very harsh and difficult. Of course, the conditions were brutal, with the heat and the desert-like conditions, often jamming weapons and leaving motorized vehicles stranded in the sand. Compounding problems was the fact that they confronted in northern Africa one of the most capable generals in all of world history, the German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox. Time and again, British and American forces seemed to have Rommel penned in, only to see him somehow manage to escape and keep his forces intact to fight another day. And in many ways, this was a game of delaying the war as long as he could. Rommel kept the Allied forces occupied in northern Africa for the better part of a year before he finally retreated with his German Africa Corps, pulling his forces back up through Italy to regroup in mid-1943. At that point, the Allies decided to continue with their strategy of pursuing the soft underbelly. In the summer of 1943, they launched an invasion of Sicily, which was perhaps one of the easiest and most successful attacks of the entire war. The battle-tested Allied forces met almost exclusively Italian troops defending Sicily, and so the going was relatively quick and easy, and they made the leap over to Italy. The progress through Italy was much slower and much tougher than the relatively easy invasion of Sicily. Rommel and his forces had once again moved into Italy and defended the very rocky and difficult terrain. Italy is very mountainous. There are any number of narrow passes through the mountains which are far more easy to defend than they are to attack and conquer. And that was the German strategy in defending Italy. They dug into many of these mountain passes, and it made for incredibly difficult battles for the Allies to achieve victory. One of the other things that the Germans did in Italy was they would occupy the many historic buildings in Italy, occupy a 1,000-year-old monastery, for instance, and sort of dare the Allies to bomb them, to get them out. The Allies were very reluctant to destroy these irreplaceable historic kinds of buildings, and so they engaged in much closer combat and almost hand-to-hand combat, trying to root the Germans out. But the invasion of Italy was very slow-going, very difficult fighting, and in fact, it was only 2 days before the D-Day invasion itself that Rome fell and the Allies finally conquered Italy. So some people look back on these adventures in northern Africa and Sicily and Italy as a terrific waste of time. It took nearly 2 years for Allied forces to make their way all the way up through Italy. Others argue that it was a process of sapping German resources, preoccupying Rommel and the German forces, and that perhaps without the invasion of Italy, the D-Day invasion itself would have failed. So much of this is that kind of speculative what-if history. What if we had invaded sooner? What if we had launched the D-Day invasion in 1942? What if we had never gone through Italy? Would D-Day have failed? There's really no way to answer these, but historians have debated and discussed them at great length. Throughout this period, the Allied efforts in the Atlantic were achieving greater successes. The German wolf packs, by the end of 1942, were being driven back, and the Allies were having much greater success in detecting and attacking them. Much of this related to improvement in technology, and certainly warfare always has a way of sparking our ingenuity and inventiveness, coming up with better ways to attack each other and defeat each other. During this period, radar was becoming much stronger. The range of radar detection was growing rapidly during this time. So that rather than detecting only objects that were fairly close by, now we were capable of detecting objects miles distant from wherever the radar itself was. Other weapons were also contributing to these successes. The development of sonar. So now we were able to detect the German submarines while they were underwater. And while it was hardly perfect, it was much better than having no idea where the German submarines were. And also improving ways to attack them while they were underwater. So things like depth charges were improving dramatically. A final development of this period was that after great and painstaking and time-consuming efforts, the Allies had finally managed to crack the German codes. These codes were set by a machine known as the Enigma machine. And it was claimed that the codes were unbreakable. And they may have been unbreakable had the Germans themselves not gotten a little bit careless and a little bit sloppy in the sort of messages they were sending over the codes. A movie that has come out in recent years called The Imitation Game is a really, really good, it's excellent movie, but it's also a good sort of historical lesson in the ways that these codes were finally broken. And once the codes were broken, it gave the Allies full access to an understanding of where the German forces were, and especially where the German U-boats or submarines were, and what their intentions were. However, this also led to a bit of a moral conundrum. What do we do with that information? And actually, if you see the movie The Imitation Game, and I encourage you to do it, the very first code that they cracked indicated that one of the ships that the German U-boats were targeting, one of the characters in the movie, his brother was stationed on that ship. And so the immediate response was, we've got to change course, we've got to alert them, we've got to do something. And yet they couldn't do that, because to radically change course or to counterattack or something like that would have tipped the Germans off that the code was broken. And this was certainly not only an element of this movie, this was a real aspect of the rest of the war. What do we do with the information we have? And any number of times it was simply a matter of hunkering down and preparing. You know the attack is coming, but you cannot do anything to alter your course or try to prevent it. With the successes of 1943 and achieving victory in northern Africa, beginning the process of moving into Italy, and also driving back the wolf packs, Allied leaders began to consider the possibility of launching that second front, launching the attack that would come to be known as D-Day into Europe. Allied leaders met at Tehran in the summer of 1943, and this was the first time that what we come to know as the Big Three met face-to-face: Stalin, FDR, and Churchill. Stalin, of course, had been asking for a second front, a D-Day style attack, for well over a year, and Churchill and FDR had been delaying. So there was certainly some awkwardness in this meeting. But eventually, FDR and Churchill agree to begin the planning process for what would become the D-Day invasion. This becomes the most complex and largest attack in the history of mankind. And so it took nearly a year to get all the forces in place and prepare for the attack that we come to know as D-Day.